Thank you for listening to another episode of Storywave. This is the third of 3 parts of Omnilingual. Lunch at the Huts was a hasty meal with a gabble of full-mouthed and excited talking. Hewitt Penrose and his chief subordinates snatched their food in a huddled consultation at one end of the table. In the afternoon, work was suspended on everything else, and the 50-odd men and women of the expedition concentrated their efforts on the university. By the middle of the afternoon, the 7th floor had been completely examined, photographed and sketched, and the murals in the square central hall covered with protective tarpaulins, and Laurent Jekyll and his air sealing crew had moved in and were at work. It had been decided to seal the central hall at the entrances. It took the French-Canadian engineer most of the afternoon to find all the ventilation ducts and plug them. An elevator shaft on the north side was found reaching clear to the 25th floor. This would give access to the top of the building. Another shaft from the center would take care of the floors below. Nobody seemed willing to trust the ancient elevators themselves. It was the next evening before a couple of cars and the necessary machinery could be fabricated in the machine shops aboard the ship and sent down by landing rocket. By that time, the air sealing was finished. The nuclear electric energy converters were in place, and the oxygen generators set up. Martha was in the lower basement an hour or so before lunch the day after, when a couple of Space Force officers came out of the elevator, bringing extra lights with them. She was still using oxygen equipment. It was a moment before she realized that the newcomers had no masks, and that one of them was smoking. She took off her own helmet speaker, throat mic, and mask, and unslung her tank pack, breathing cautiously. The air was chilly and musty acrid with the odor of antiquity, the first Martian odor she had smelled. But when she lit a cigarette, the lighter flamed clear and steady, and the tobacco caught and burned evenly. The archaeologists, many of the other civilian scientists, a few of the Space Force officers, and the 2 news correspondents, Sid Chamberlain and Gloria Standish, moved in that evening, setting up cots in vacant rooms. They installed electric stoves and a refrigerator in the old library reading room, and put in a bar and lunch counter. For a few days, the place was full of noise and activity. Then, gradually, the Space Force people and all but a few of the civilians returned to their own work. There was still the business of air sealing the more habitable of the buildings already explored, and fitting them up in readiness for the arrival, in a year and a half, of the 500 members of the main expedition. There was work to be done enlarging the landing field for the ship's rocket craft and building new chemical fuel tanks. There was the work of getting the city's ancient reservoirs cleared of silt before the next spring thaw brought more water down the underground aqueducts everybody called canals, in mistranslation of Schiaparelli's Italian word, though this was proving considerably easier than anticipated. The ancient canal builders must have anticipated a time when their descendants would no longer be capable of maintenance work, and had prepared against it. By the day after the university had been made completely habitable, the actual work there was being done by Selim, Tony Latimer, and herself, with half a dozen Space Force officers, mostly girls, and 4 or 5 civilians helping. They worked from the bottom up, dividing the floor surfaces into numbered squares, measuring and listing and sketching and photographing. They packaged samples of organic matter and sent them up to the ship for carbon-14 dating and analysis. They opened cans and jars and bottles and found that everything fluid in them had evaporated through the porosity of glass and metal and plastic if there were no other way. Wherever they looked, they found evidence of activity suddenly suspended and never resumed. A vise with a bar of metal in it, half cut through, and the hacksaw beside it. Pots and pans with hardened remains of food in them, a leathery cut of meat on a table with a knife ready at hand. Toilet articles on washstands, unmade beds, the bedding ready to crumble at a touch but still retaining the impress of the sleeper's body. Papers and writing materials on desks as though the writer had gotten up, meaning to return in a 50,000 year ago moment. It worried her. Irrationally, she began to feel that the Martians had never left this place, that they were still around her, watching disapprovingly every time she picked up something they had laid down. They haunted her dreams now, instead of their enigmatic writing. At first, everybody who had moved into the university had taken a separate room, happy to escape the crowding and lack of privacy of the huts. After a few nights, she was glad when Gloria Standish moved in with her, and accepted the newswoman's excuse that she felt lonely without somebody to talk to before falling asleep. Sachiko Korimitsu joined them the next evening, and before going to bed, the girl officer cleaned and oiled her pistol, remarking that she was afraid some rust may have gotten into it. The others felt it, too. Selim von Olmhurst developed the habit of turning quickly and looking behind him, as though trying to surprise somebody or something that was stalking him. Tony Latimer, having a drink at the bar that had been improvised from the librarian's desk in the reading room, set down his glass and swore. "You know what this place is? It's an archaeological Marie Celeste," he declared. "It was occupied right up to the end. We've all seen the shifts these people use to keep a civilization going on here. But what was the end? What happened to them? Where did they go? You didn't expect them to be waiting out front with a big red carpet and a big banner. Welcome, Terrans, did you, Tony?" Gloria Standish asked. "No, of course not. They've all been dead for 50,000 years. But if they were the last of the Martians, why haven't we found their bones at least? Who buried them after they were dead?" He looked at the glass, a bubble-thin goblet, found, with hundreds of others like it, in a closet above, as though debating with himself whether to have another drink. Then he voted in the affirmative and reached for the cocktail pitcher. "And every door on the old ground level is either barred or barricaded from the inside. How did they get out? And why did they leave?" The next day, at lunch, Sachiko Korimitsu had the answer to the second question. 4 or 5 electrical engineers had come down by rocket from the ship, and she had been spending the morning with them in oxy masks at the top of the building. "Tony, I thought you said those generators were in good shape," she began, catching sight of Latimer. "They aren't. They're in the most unholy mess I ever saw. What happened up there was that the supports of the wind rudder gave way, and the weight snapped the main shaft and smashed everything under it." "Well, after 50,000 years, you can expect something like that," Latimer retorted. "When an archaeologist says something's in good shape, he doesn't necessarily mean it'll start as soon as you shove a switch in." "You didn't notice that it happened when the power was on, did you?" one of the engineers asked, nettled at Latimer's tone. "Well, it was. Everything's burned out or shorted or fused together. I saw one bus bar 8 inches across melted clean in two. It's a pity we didn't find things in good shape, even archaeologically speaking. I saw a lot of interesting things in advance of what we're using now, but it'll take a couple of years to get everything sorted out and figure out what it looked like originally. Did it look as though anybody made an attempt to fix it? Martha asked. Sachiko shook her head. They must have taken one look at it and given up. I don't believe there would have been any possible way to repair anything. Well, that explains why they left. They needed electricity for lighting and heating, and all their industrial equipment was electrical. They had a good life here, with power. Without it, this place wouldn't have been habitable. Then why did they barricade everything from the inside? And how did they get out? Latimer wanted to know. To keep people from breaking in and looting. Last man out probably barred the last door and slid down a rope from upstairs, Von Olmhurst suggested. This Houdini trick doesn't worry me too much. We'll find out eventually. Yes, about the time Martha starts reading Martian, Latimer scoffed. That may be just when we'll find out, Von Olmhurst replied seriously. It wouldn't surprise me if they left something in writing when they evacuated this place. Are you really beginning to treat this pipe dream of hers as a serious possibility, Selim? Latimer demanded. I know, it would be a wonderful thing, but wonderful things don't happen just because they're wonderful. Only because they're possible, and this isn't. Let me quote that distinguished Hittitologist, Johannes Friedrich. Nothing can be translated out of nothing. Or that later but not less distinguished Hittitologist, Selim von Olmhurst. Where are you going to get your bilingual? Friedrich lived to see the Hittite language deciphered and read, von Olmhurst reminded him. Yes, when they found Hittite-Assyrian bilinguals. Latimer measured a spoonful of coffee powder into his cup and added hot water. Martha, you ought to know, better than anybody, how little chance you have. You've been working for years in the Indus Valley. How many words of Harappa have you or anybody else ever been able to read? We've never found a university with a 500,000 volume library at Harappa or Mohenjo-Daro. And the first day we entered this building, we established meanings for several words, Selim von Olmhurst added. And you've never found another meaningful word since, Latimer added. And you're only sure of general meaning, not specific meaning of word elements, and you have a dozen different interpretations for each word. We made a start, von Olmhurst maintained. We have Grodefen's word for king. But I'm going to be able to read some of those books over there, if it takes me the rest of my life here. It probably will, anyhow. You mean you've changed your mind about going home on the Cyrano? Martha asked. You'll stay on here? The old man nodded. I can't leave this. There's too much to discover. The old dog will have to learn a lot of new tricks, but this is where my work will be from now on. Latimer was shocked. You're nuts, he cried. You mean you're going to throw away everything we've accomplished in Hittitology and start all over again here on Mars? Martha, if you talked him into this crazy decision, you're a criminal. Nobody talked me into anything, von Olmhurst said roughly. And as for throwing away what I've accomplished in Hittitology, I don't know what the devil you're talking about. Everything I know about the Hittite Empire is published and available to anybody. Hittitology is like Egyptology. It's stopped being research and archaeology and become scholarship and history. And I'm not a scholar or historian. I'm a pick and shovel field archaeologist, a highly skilled and specialized grave robber and junk picker. And there's more pick and shovel work on this planet than I could do in 100 lifetimes. This is something new. I was a fool to think I could turn my back on it and go back to scribbling footnotes about Hittite kings. You could have anything you wanted in Hittitology. There are a dozen universities that'd sooner have you than a winning football team. But no, you have to be the top man in Martiology too. You can't leave that for anybody else. Latimer shoved his chair back and got to his feet, leaving the table with an oath that was almost a sob of exasperation. Maybe his feelings were too much for him. Maybe he realized, as Martha did, what he had betrayed. She sat avoiding the eyes of others, looking at the ceiling, as embarrassed as though Latimer had flung something dirty on the table in front of them. Tony Latimer had, desperately, wanted Selim to go home on the Cyrano. Martiology was a new field. If Selim entered it, he would bring with him the reputation he had already built in Hittitology, automatically stepping into the leading role that Latimer had coveted for himself. Ivan Fitzgerald's words echoed back to her. When you want to be a big shot, you can't bear the possibility of anyone else being a bigger big shot. His derision of her own efforts became comprehensible too. It wasn't that he was convinced that she would never learn to read the Martian language. He had been afraid that she would. Ivan Fitzgerald finally isolated the germ that had caused the Finchley girls' undiagnosed illness. Shortly afterward, the malady turned into a mild fever, from which she recovered. Nobody else seemed to have caught it. Fitzgerald was still trying to figure out how the germ had been transmitted. They found a globe of Mars, made when the city had been a seaport. They located the city and learned that its name had been Kukan, or something like a similar vowel-consonant ratio. Immediately, Sid Chamberlain and Gloria Standish began giving their telecasts a Kukan dateline, and Hubert Penrose used the name in his official reports. They had also found a Martian calendar. The year had been divided into 10 more or less equal months, and one of them had been Doma. Another month was Nor, and that was a part of the name of the scientific journal Martha had found. Bill Chandler, the zoologist, had been going deeper and deeper into the old sea bottom of Syrtis, 400 miles from Kukan. At 15,000 feet lower altitude, he shot a bird. At least, it was something with wings and what were almost but not quite feathers, though it was more reptilian than avian in general characteristics. He and Ivan Fitzgerald skinned and mounted it, and then dissected the carcass almost tissue by tissue. About 7/8 of its body capacity was lungs. It certainly breathed air containing at least half enough oxygen to support human life, or 5 times as much as the air around Kukan. That took the center of interest away from archaeology and started a new burst of activity. All the expedition's aircraft, 4 jetacopters and 3 wingless Airdyne reconnaissance fighters, were thrown into intensified exploration of the lower sea bottoms. And the bioscience boys and girls were wild with excitement and making new discoveries on each flight. The university was left to Selim and Martha and Tony Latimer, the latter keeping to himself while she and the old Turco-German worked together. The civilian specialists in other fields, and the Space Force people who had been holding tape lines and making sketches and snapping cameras, were all flying to lower Syrtis to find out how much oxygen there was and what kind of life it supported. Sometimes, Sachiko dropped in. Most of the time she was busy helping Ivan Fitzgerald dissect specimens. They had 4 or 5 species of what might loosely be called birds, and something that could easily be classed as a reptile, and a carnivorous mammal the size of a cat with bird-like claws, and a herbivore almost identical with the pig-like thing in the big Darfulva mural, and another like a gazelle with a single horn in the middle of its forehead. The high point came when one party, at 30,000 feet below the level of Kukan, found breathable air. One of them had a mild attack of soroche and had to be flown back for treatment in a hurry, but the others showed no ill effects. The daily newscasts from Terra showed a corresponding shift in interest at home. The discovery of the university had focused attention on the dead past of Mars. Now the public was interested in Mars as a possible home for humanity. It was Tony Latimer who brought archaeology back into the activities of the expedition and the news at home. Martha and Selim were working in the museum on the 2nd floor, scrubbing the grime from the glass cases, noting contents, and grease penciling numbers. Latimer and a couple of Space Force officers were going through what had been the administrative offices on the other side. was one of these, a young second lieutenant, who came hurrying in from the mezzanine, almost bursting with excitement. "Hey Martha! Dr. von Olmhurst!" he was shouting. "Where are you? Tony's found the Martians!" Selim dropped his rag back in the bucket. She laid her clipboard on top of the case beside her. "Where?" they asked together. "Over on the north side." The lieutenant took hold of himself and spoke more deliberately. "Little room, back of one of the old faculty offices. Conference room. It was locked from the inside, and we had to burn it down with a torch. That's where they are. 18 of them, around a long table." Gloria Standish, who had dropped in for lunch, was on the mezzanine, fairly screaming into a radiophone extension. "Dozen and a half of them. Well, of course they're dead. What a question. They look like skeletons covered with leather. No, I did not know what they died of. Well, forget it. I don't care if Bill Chandler's found a 3-headed hippopotamus. Sid, don't you get it? We found the Martians." She slammed the phone back on its hook, rushing away ahead of them. Martha remembered the closed door. On the first survey, they hadn't attempted opening it. Now it was burned away at both sides and lay, still hot, along the edges, on the floor of the big office room in front. A floodlight was on in the room inside, and Latimer was going around looking at things while the Space Force officer stood by the door. The center of the room was filled by a long table. In armchairs around it sat the 18 men and women who had occupied the room for the last 50 millennia. There were bottles and glasses on the table in front of them, and, had she seen them in a dimmer light, she would have thought that they were merely dozing over their drinks. One had a knee hooked over his armchair and was curled in fetus-like sleep. Another had fallen forward onto the table, arms extended, the emerald set of a ring twinkling dully on one finger. Skeletons covered with leather, Gloria Standish had called them, and so they were. Faces like skulls, arms and legs like sticks, the flesh shrunken onto the bones under it. "Isn't this something?" Latimer was exulting. "Mass suicide, that's what it was. Notice what's in the corners? Braziers, made of perforated 2-gallon-odd metal cans, the white walls smudged with smoke above them." Von Olmhurst had noticed them at once, and he was poking into one of them with his flashlight. "Yes, charcoal. I noticed a quantity of it around a couple of hand forges in the shop on the first floor. That's why you had so much trouble breaking in. They'd sealed the room on the inside." He straightened and went around the room, and he found a ventilator and peered into it, stuffed with rags. They must have been all that were left here. Their power was gone, and they were old and tired, and all around them their world was dying. So they just came in here and lit the charcoal, and sat drinking together till they all fell asleep. Well, we know what became of them now, anyhow. Sid and Gloria made the most of it. The Terran public wanted to hear about the Martians, and if live Martians couldn't be found, a room full of dead ones was the next best thing. Maybe an even better thing. It had been only 60-odd years since the Orson Welles invasion scare. Tony Latimer, the Discoverer, was beginning to cash in on his attentions to Gloria and his ingratiation with Sid. He was always either making voice and image talks for telecast or listening to the news from the home planet. Without question, he had become, overnight, the most widely known archaeologist in history. "Not that I'm interested in all this for myself," he disclaimed, after listening to the telecast from Terra for 2 days after his discovery. "But this is going to be a big thing for Martian archaeology. Bring it to the public attention. Dramatize it. Selim, can you remember when Lord Carnarvon and Howard Carter found the tomb of Tutankhamun? In 1923? I was 2 years old then," Von Olmhurst chuckled. "I really don't know how much that publicity ever did for Egyptology. Oh, the museums did devote more space to Egyptian exhibits. And after a museum department gets a few extra showcases, you know how hard it is to make him give them up. And for a while. it was easier to get financial support for new excavations. But I don't know how much good all this public excitement really does in the long run. Well, I think one of us should go back on the Cyrano, when the Schiaparelli orbits in, Latimer said. I'd hoped it would be you. Your voice would carry the most weight. But I think it's important that one of us go back to present the story of our work and what we've accomplished and what we hope to accomplish to the public and to the universities and the learned societies and to the Federation government. There will be a great deal of work that will have to be done. We must not allow the other scientific fields and the so-called practical interests to monopolize public and academic support. So, I believe I shall go back for at least a while and see what I can do. Lectures. The Organization of a Society of Martian Archaeology with Anthony Latimer, Ph.D., the logical candidate for the chair. Degrees, honors, the deference of the learned, and the adulation of the lay public. Positions with impressive titles and salaries. Sweet are the uses of publicity. She crushed out her cigarette and got to her feet. Well, I still have the final lists of what we found in Helvolva Biology department to check over. I'm starting on Sornova tomorrow, and I want that stuff in shape for expert evaluation. That was the sort of thing Tony Latimer wanted to get away from the detail work and the drudgery. Let the infantry do the slogging through the mud. The brass hats got the medals. She was halfway through the 5th floor a week later, and was having midday lunch in the reading room on the 1st floor when Hubert Penrose came over and sat down beside her, asking her what she was doing. She told him. I wonder if you could find me a couple of men for an hour or so, she added. I'm stopped by a couple of jammed doors at the central hall. Lecture room and library, if the layout of that floor is anything like the ones below it. Yes, I'm a pretty fair doorbuster myself. He looked around the room. There's Jeff Miles. He isn't doing much of anything. And we'll put Sid Chamberlain to work for a change, too. The 4 of us ought to get your doors open. He called the Chamberlain, who was carrying his tray, over to the dishwasher. Oh, Sid, you doing anything for the next hour or so? I was going up to the 4th floor to see what Tony's doing. Forget it. Tony's bagged his season limit of Martians. I'm going to help Martha bust in a couple of doors. We'll probably find a whole cemetery full of Martians. Chamberlain shrugged. Why not? A jammed door can have anything back of it. And I know what Tony's doing. Just routine stuff. Jeff Miles, the Space Force captain, came over, accompanied by one of the lab crew from the ship who had come down on the rocket the day before. This ought to be up your alley, Mort, he was saying to his companion. Chemistry and physics department. Want to come along? The lab man, Mort Tranter, was willing. Seeing the sights was what he'd come down from the ship for. She finished her coffee and cigarette, and they went out into the hall together, gathered equipment, and rode the elevator to the 5th floor. The lecture hall door was the nearest. They attacked it first. With proper equipment and help, it was no problem, and in 10 minutes they had it open wide enough to squeeze through with the floodlights. The room inside was quite empty, and, like most of the rooms behind closed doors, comparatively free from dust. The students, it appeared, had sat with their backs to the door facing a low platform, but their seats and the lecturer's table and equipment had been removed. The 2 side walls bore inscription. On the right, a pattern of concentric circles which she recognized as a diagram of atomic structure, and on the left a complicated table of numbers and words in 2 columns. Tranter was pointing at the diagram on the right. They got as far as the Bohr atom anyhow, he said. Well, not quite. They knew about the electron shells, but they have the nucleus pictured as a solid mass. No indication of proton and neutron structure. I'll bet, when you come to translate their scientific books, you'll find that they taught that the atom was the ultimate and indivisible particle. That explains why you people never found any evidence that the Martians used nuclear energy. That's a uranium atom, Captain Miles mentioned. It is? Sid Chamberlain asked excitedly. Then they did know about atomic energy. Just because we haven't found any pictures of A-bomb mushrooms doesn't mean... She turned to look at the other wall. Sid's signal reactions were getting away from him again. Uranium meant nuclear power to him, and the two words were interchangeable. As she studied the arrangement of the numbers and words, she could hear Tranter saying, "Nuts, Sid. We knew about uranium a long time before anybody found out what could be done with it. Uranium was discovered on Terra in 1789 by Klaproth." There was something familiar about the table on the left wall. She tried to remember what she had been taught in school about physics, and what she had picked up by accident afterward. The second column was a continuation of the first. There were 46 items in each item numbered consecutively. "Probably used uranium because it's the largest of the natural atoms," Penrose was saying. The fact that there's nothing beyond it there shows that they hadn't created any of the transuranics. A student could go to that thing and point out the outer electron of any of the 92 elements. 92! That was it. There were 92 items in the table on the left wall. Hydrogen was number 1, she knew. 1, Sarfaldzorn. Helium was 2, that was Tirfaldzorn. She couldn't remember which element came next, but in Martian, it was Sarvaldavas. Sorn must mean matter, or substance then. And Devas? She was trying to think of what it could be. She turned quickly to the others, catching hold of Hewart Penrose's arm with one hand and waving her clipboard with the other. "Look at this thing, over here!" she was clamoring excitedly. "Tell me what you think it is. Could it be a table of the elements?" They all turned to look. Mort Tranter stared at it for a moment. "Could be. If I only knew what those squiggles meant." That was right. He'd spent his time aboard the ship. "If you could read the numbers, would that help?" she asked, beginning to set down the Arabic digits and their Martian equivalents. "It's decimal system, the same as we use." "Sure. If that's a table of elements, all I'd need would be the numbers." "Thanks," he added as she tore off the sheet and gave it to him. Penrose knew the numbers and was ahead of him. 92 items, numbered consecutively. The first number would be the atomic number, then a single word, the name of the element, then the atomic weight. She began reading off the names of the elements. "I know hydrogen and helium. What's Tirfaldavas, the third one?" "Lithium," Tranter said. "The atomic weights aren't run out past the decimal point. Hydrogen's 1+, if that double hook dingus is a plus sign. Helium's 4+, that's right. And lithium's given as 7, that isn't right. It's 6.940. Or is that thing a Martian minus sign? Of course, look! A plus sign is a hook, to hang things together. A minus sign is a knife, to cut something off from something. See, the little loop is the handle, and the long pointed loop is the blade. Stylized, of course, but that's what it is. And the fourth element, Kiradavas, what's that? Beryllium. Atomic weight given as 9 in a hook. Actually, it's 9.02. Sid Chamberlain had been disgruntled because he couldn't get a story about the Martians having developed atomic energy. It took him a few minutes to understand the newest development, but it finally dawned on him. "Hey, you're reading that," he cried. "You're reading Martian." "That's right," Penrose told him. "Just reading it right off. I don't get the 2 items after the atomic weight, though. They look like months of the Martian calendar. What ought they to be, Mort?" Tranter hesitated. "Well, the next information after the atomic weight ought to be the period and group numbers. Those are words. What would be the numbers for the first one, hydrogen?" "Period 1, group 1. 1 electron shell. 1 electron in the outer shell," Tranter told her. "Helium's period 1, too, but it has the outer only electron shell full, so it's in the group of inert elements. Trav's the first month of the year, and helium's Trav, Yenth. Yenth is the 8th month. The inert elements could be called group 8, yes, and the third element, lithium, is period 2, group 1. That check?" "It certainly does. Samv, Trav, Same as the second month. What's the first element in period 3? Sodium, number 11. That's right, it's Trav. Why, the names of the months are simply numbers, 1 to 10, spelled out. Dome is the 5th month. That was your first Martian word, Martha, Penrose told her. The word for 5. And if Davos is the word for metal, and Sornova is chemistry and or physics, I'll bet Tadavas Sornova is literally translated as of metal, matter knowledge. Metallurgy, in other words. I wonder what Master Nova means. It surprised her that, after so long, and with so much happening in the meantime, he could remember that. Something like journal, review, or maybe quarterly. We'll work that out too, she said confidently. After this, nothing seemed impossible. Maybe we can find... Then she stopped short. You said quarterly. I think it was monthly instead. It was dated for a specific month, the 5th one. And if Nor is 10, Master Norvad could be year 10th. And I'll bet we find that Mastar is the word for year. She looked at the table on the wall again. Well, let's get all these words down, with translations for as many as we can. Let's take a break for a minute, Penrose suggested, getting out his cigarettes. And then, let's do this in comfort. Jeff, suppose you and Sid could go across the hall and see what you find in the other room, in the way of a desk or something like that, and a few chairs. There will be a lot of work to do on this. Sid Chamberlain had been squirming as though he were afflicted with ants, trying to contain himself. Now he let go with an excited jabber. This is really it. The it, not just it of the week, like finding the reservoirs or those statues or this building, or even the animals and the dead Martians. Wait till Selim and Tony see this. Wait till Tony sees it. I want to see his face. And when I get this on telecast, all Terra is going to go nuts about it. He turned to Captain Miles. Jeff, suppose you take a look at that other door, while I find somebody to send to tell Selim and Tony. And Gloria, wait till she sees this. Take it easy, Sid, Martha cautioned. You'd better let me have a look at your script before you go too far overboard on the telecast. This is just a beginning. It'll take years and years before we're able to read any of those books downstairs. It'll go faster than you think, Martha, Hubert Penrose told her. We'll all work on it, and we'll teleprint material to Terra, and people there will work on it. We'll send them everything we can. Everything we work out, and copies of books, and copies of your word lists. And there would be other tables, astronomical tables, tables in physics and mechanics, for instance, in which words and numbers were equivalent. The library stacks below would be full of them. Transliterate them into Roman alphabet spellings and Arabic numerals, and somewhere, somebody would spot each numeral's significance, as Hubert Penrose and Mort Tranter and she had done with the table of elements. And pick out all those chemistry textbooks in the library. New words would take on meaning from contexts in which the names of the elements appeared. She'd have to start studying chemistry and physics herself. Sachiko Korimitsu peeped in through the door, then stepped aside. Is there anything I can do? She began. What's happened? Something important? Important? Look at that, Sachi. We're reading it. Martha's found out how to read Martian. He grabbed Captain Miles by the arm. Come on, Jeff, let's go. I want to call the others. He was still babbling as he hurried from the room. Sachi looked at the inscription. Is it true? She asked. And then, before Martha could more than begin to explain, flung her arms around her. Oh, it really is. You were reading it. I'm so happy. She had to start explaining again when Selim von Olmhurst entered. This time, she was able to finish. But Martha, can you really be sure? You know by now that learning to read this language is as important to me as it is to you. But how can you be so sure that those words really mean things like hydrogen and helium and boron and oxygen? How do you know that the table of elements was anything like ours? Tranter and Penrose and Sachiko all looked at him in amazement. This isn't just the Martian table of elements. That's the table of elements. It's the only one there is. Mort Tranter almost exploded. Look, hydrogen has 1 proton and 1 electron. If it had more of either, it wouldn't be hydrogen. It'd be something else. And the same with all the rest of the elements. And hydrogen on Mars is the same as hydrogen on Terra, or on Alpha Centauri, or in the next galaxy. You just set up those numbers in that order, and any first-year chemistry student could tell you what elements they represented, Penrose said. Could if he expected to make a passing grade, that is. The old man shook his head slowly, smiling. I'm afraid I wouldn't make a passing grade. I didn't know, or at least I didn't realize that. One of the things I'm going to place an order for to be brought in on Schiaparelli will be a set of primers in chemistry and physics, of the sort intended for a bright child of 10 or 12. It seems that a Martiologist has to learn a lot of things the Hittites and the Assyrians never heard about. Tony Latimer, coming in, caught the last part of the explanation. He looked quickly at the walls and, having found out just what had happened, advanced and caught Martha by the hand. You really did it, Martha. You found your bilingual. I never believed that it would be possible. Let me congratulate you. He probably expected that to erase all the jibes and sneers of the past. If he did, he could have it that way. His friendship would mean as little to her as his derision, except that his friends had to watch their backs and his knife, but he was going home on the Cyrano to be a big shot. Or had this changed his mind for him again? This is something we can show the world to justify any expenditure of time and money on Martian archaeological work. When I get back to Terra, I'll see that you're given full credit for this achievement. On Terra, her back and his knife would be out of her watchfulness. We won't need to wait for that long, Hubert Penrose told him dryly. I'm sending off an official report tomorrow. You can be sure Dr. Dane will be given full credit. Not only for this work, but for her previous work, which made it possible to exploit this discovery. And you might add, work done in spite of the doubts and discouragements of her colleagues, Thela von Olmhurst said, to which I am ashamed to have to confess my own share. You said we had to find a bilingual, she said. You were right, too. This is better than a bilingual, Martha, Hubert Penrose said. Physical science expresses universal facts. Necessarily, it is a universal language. Heretofore, archaeologists have dealt only with pre-scientific cultures. Thank you for listening to another episode of Storywave. This has been the third of 3 parts of Omnilingual. Please let us know what you think about this episode or any of the previous episodes by sending us a message to the email you can find below in the episode description, or fill out the survey underneath any of the episodes. Until next time, hang on to any special-looking rocks or stones you find. They just might come in handy, history-wise.